Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, How to Select Supply Chain Planning Software. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. My name is Kristen Tiley, the Director of Marketing here at Arqiva, and I am your moderator today. Discussing the topic will be Sujit Singh, COO here at Arqiva. Sujit, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, hey, thanks, Kristen. Name is Sujit Singh. I've been here at Arqiva for 25 plus years and have participated in a lot of selection processes. So this is a webinar that is different from what we usually talk about, which is typically around supply chain topics. But given that we participate in so many supply chain selection processes, I think it'll be a fun topic.
Great, thank you. We do have a few announcements before we begin. If at any point you have trouble hearing us, please let us know using the chat feature and we'll be sure to assist you. We do have polling questions in today's sessions. We encourage you to respond when they pop up. And then there will be time at the end of the session for questions, and you may submit an online question at any point using the questions window. Before I hand it over to Sujit, I'd like to share a little bit about Arqiva. For more than 30 years, Arqiva has helped global enterprises drive business transformation through improved supply chain processes. Recognized by Gartner in the Gartner Supply Chain Planning Solutions Magic Quadrant, everything we do is aimed at solving complex planning challenges and creating cutting-edge technology that enables you to run your business at peak performance. We continually challenge ourselves to create solutions that not only solve today's challenges, but future challenges as well. We live in a dynamic world where speed, accuracy, and efficiency are critical to drive business transformation, and we believe that starts with better planning. Our goal is to enable your business to benefit and thrive from the way our solutions unlock the true value of your supply chain. Our fully integrated S&OP solution is a demand-driven business planning process that promotes cross-functional synchronization within the company, starting from integrated financial planning to demand and inventory management to create a more dynamic S&OP process using real-time dashboards. And I think we have our first polling question after this slide, yes. So to kick things off today, we're going to start with our first poll, and it is, what is your biggest challenge when beginning your vendor selection process for supply chain planning software? Is it too many vendor options and they're hard to compare? Difficulty defining business needs and requirements? RFP process takes too long with no clear answers, or getting internal buy-in? Okay, great. It looks like the votes have come in, and the majority of people identified the difficulty defining business needs and requirements as the biggest challenge when doing a vendor selection process. So you're in for some good tips and guidance for today's webinar. So with that, I will hand things over to Sujit.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, so let's look at the agenda. So we'll talk a little bit about why selecting the right software matters. And then we'll jump into the nitty-gritty of how to select the right provider. And in that part of the process, you have to understand and identify your business needs. So how do you do that? How do you research and create a list of vendors to evaluate? What kind of processes you go through, whether it's an RFI, demo, RFPs, use case demos. And then, once you reach the final decision, what are still the next steps that you need to think about? So we'll go through this. Let's start at why selecting the right software matters. And so if you are going through a process to improve your supply chain planning, and if you are so lucky to pick the right vendor, then for sure you will achieve greater business value. Whatever goals you had in terms of doing the selection, and then eventually, of course, implementing, will lead you to a higher business value. It does help to keep in mind that it's ultimately about the business value. It's certainly possible that one can have a great selection process, but does not get to the business value. So both the selection as well as the second step, which is implementation, are a means to an end. And the end is the final creation of business value by better supply chain planning. So the vendor should help you get to that higher business value. Sometimes that could mean that there are improved supply chain efficiencies, there are cost savings. Since corporations have multiple systems, there is certainly an integration with existing systems. And by contrast, the wrong vendor will lead you through potentially a poor implementation, poor adoption by the users, which leads to lower business value, increased costs due to hidden fees or excessive customization. That is self-explanatory. And then, of course, the right vendor will expand with you, grow with you, scale with you, but the wrong vendor might be very static. It may be okay for right now, but may not be okay in 2 years from now. All right, so those are some important reasons why we want to select the right software, right vendor. So let's get into how to select the right supply chain planning software. So here's an overview of the selection process. We want to start with understanding and identifying the business needs, put them in writing. Then we want to have some amount of research done internally, potentially to create a list of vendors to evaluate. We want to have a request for information, which is a lighter document compared to request for proposal, so RFI instead of RFP, to initially qualify the vendors from a long list to a short list. That might require a short demo as well, so you might as well do that to at least get a feel for the software. Now, this is a short demo, so this is not a very detailed demo. Then from there, we go to some kind of short list. And for those companies, vendors that are shortlisted, you want to do a very detailed RFP, potentially with weighted questions. Maybe the word very is subjective. You certainly don't want a 5,000 line RFP. That's not what I'm saying, but it should be more detailed than RFI. You should have use cases based demonstration of their product where you can actually see how it will help you solve your particular problems. You may want your IT team to talk to them about security and integration, and then of course final decision and moving forward. So this gets us to our second polling question. What do you currently use to begin evaluating vendors when looking for supply chain planning software? Do you have an RFI, RFP process? Do you do demos? Do you do POC or use case demos? Or you maybe don't follow a structured approach. So this particular poll is a multi-select. You can select multiple options. So we'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and vote, and then we'll move on from there. All right, so it seems there is heavy reliance on demos. 63% voted the second and the third option, which is not surprising. When you're looking at software, you do want to see it in action. A quarter of you have voted that you do rely on an RFI, RFP process, and about the same amount have said we don't have a structured approach. So hopefully this webinar will lead you to a more structured approach. All right, thank you for voting. Let's move on to the next slide. So how do you go about understanding and identifying your business needs? Well, step one is to get organized internally. So you need to define your key stakeholders that will participate in this selection process. That could be from multiple departments in any corporation of any size, reasonable size. So you have end users, which are your planners, supply chain planners, and forecasters, and inventory planners, and people like that. You certainly have your supply chain leaders. They can be directors, VP of supply chain. You have IT team. They may not have a full say in what they like or they want to use, but they certainly can have a say in what they will not allow given the IT landscape of the company. So you want to make sure to get that input. I've seen many selection processes where IT team was only brought in the end and they raised a flag and said, we cannot work with this particular software because it does not meet this XYZ criteria, the IT criteria. So while they cannot say yes, they can easily say no. So you've got to make sure you involve them early on. Finance people, we have obviously the question of budget, but also supply chain planning is connected to finance. You make more money by doing supply chain planning better. So you want to, sometimes they want to actually be users of the supply chain planning output. So you may want to incorporate the finance team from both angles, budget as well as potentially being users. And then, of course, finally, the procurement team will be involved. So sometimes it's best to give them a heads up, and maybe they will not participate in every meeting, but they should be aware that this selection process is going on, and eventually they will need to get involved. Now, this team is a multi-department, multi-person team, potentially, somewhere in the 5 to 10-person range. So it's very important to, at the same time, assign a leader, a champion. We are not talking here about the leader of the implementation project. We are talking about a leader for the selection project. So this person is very important, and we'll talk about what role they do in a few minutes. So getting organized internally means we have to understand our supply chain planning goals. We have to define our key stakeholders. We took a shot at that in the previous slide. We have to evaluate a framework or a rubric for the evaluation of the vendors. So, you don't want to leave it very subjective. I like them, I did not like them. I mean, that there is a place for being subjective as well, but you also want to have a nicely defined framework which you will use to evaluate your vendors with weighing, with scores on different criteria, and so on. It's also important to look at your data preparedness. These projects, whenever you do them, once you've done the selection, require a lot of data. So you may want to evaluate your data preparedness, because it'll be bad if you go through the selection and go to start the project and only to learn that there is no data, or not good enough data. So garbage in, garbage out can apply. And then, of course, you have to know internally what your budget expectations are. That one is easy. Everyone can understand that one. But timeline is also very important. Sometimes companies will have a notion of a particular timeline they want to hit. Maybe there is a season. Maybe Christmas is very important to your company. And so September onwards, life is crazy. So if in order for you to be going live before September, you may want to back calculate and say, we want to at the latest start the project, let's say June. And if that's where you decide, then knowing that timeline expectation and making all the vendors aware of it is also then very important. Since we talked about data preparation and the overall quality and status of your data, it's very important in these projects because, again, it's a very data intensive project. So you have to think in terms of, hey, is my data ready, or do I have to do a pre-project to get my data ready before I can do the selection process and then eventually an implementation? So you may use internal teams to look at the status of your data. You can also consult the vendors if you have already talked to one or two of them for best practices. If you are engaged with an external consulting firm, they might also be they can also guide you towards the data preparedness. But the idea is that you want to have your data ready to go, and if need be, you may want to have a little project that can lead to standardizing and cleaning the data. You may want to incorporate some data governance framework. So many a times we see that supply chain planning projects actually have a pre-project in front of them that cleans up the ERP data, be it SAP, be it Oracle. And sometimes it's cleanup, sometimes it's finding changing the processes internally with the company so that, for example, production is reported on a more routine basis, so not once a week, but potentially once a day or potentially once every 6 hours. So all these governance frameworks might need to be updated. Eventually, to make sure your data is good, you want to test and validate. All right, so data is important. Project champion is also very important. So we talked about having a leader in this part of the project, the selection part of the project. So this person, who we are calling the project champion, is in charge of managing the relationships with the vendors as we go through the process. So if vendor wants to know, hey, when is this response due? Or what do you mean by this question? Or they may give you some answers to a question and you need to evaluate that and decide if that is good enough or if it requires a further clarification. So any type of this type of evaluation needs to be coordinated, and this project champion is essentially in charge of doing that. So they act as a central point of contact. Now, this doesn't mean that they have all the answers, although it's useful if they have all the answers. But very often they are finding the right person to get the questions answered. They are making sure the communication with the vendor is streamlined. If need be, they are calculating the internal ROI or finding the right people to calculate the internal ROI. And then, of course, they prevent delays and misalignment. Now, we talk about the supply chain goals. Remember what I said earlier, selection process, implementation process, all of these are means to an end. The ultimate thing is the business value. How do you create the business value? So you need to know that up front. What business value do you aim to achieve? What change you want to see? What pain points you want to avoid? Maybe in the current system, you have 3 things that you know are very painful, take too much time, and you want to avoid them at all costs in the future system. So you want to note that down. What, if any, key functionality is required? For example, today's system might only do a 3-period average as forecast. Well, you want maybe a more sophisticated time series based methodology that incorporates seasonalities and trends and those types of things. Or maybe you are more advanced. You already do time series and you are interested in AI based methods, whether it's neural networks, whether it's gradient boosting or what have you. And so if those are your requirements, you better be very clear about that and write it down. Think about what integrations are needed. If you are an SAP shop, then obviously you want a vendor who can connect the data from SAP or integrate into SAP. Budget and timeline, of course, is related to all this because we can have everything if the budget and the timeline is infinite, but that is never the case. So we need to not only have these understanding of the goals, we also need to dial it into the budget and the timeline so we know that we have limited time, limited budget to achieve, and we may have to do some compromises in terms of what we can achieve. Then you may have goals around training. Maybe your workforce is the kind that works best if you do the train the trainer approach versus maybe it is the best when everyone sits in a classroom and the outside third party does the training. So what kind of training do you need? How much do you need? All of these are things that you would identify as part of this exercise. Let's talk a little bit about, maybe provide some mental models to evaluate these goals. So here's one that I like. Imagine the future state. So maybe standing here, you ask the question, hey, let me put myself hypothetically 5 years out into the future and look back from that hypothetical place and ask the question, if I go through the selection and the eventual project, and it was just a great success, then what would be the things that to that success? Well, then those things can become your goals because then now you know the types of things you absolutely want to do. Similarly, you can do it in reverse. You can go back out into the future, again, hypothetically, just mentally, and you are asking the question, what if my project is a failure? What are the types of mistakes I would have done to make this into a failure? And then you want to mitigate those or avoid those mistakes potentially. Similarly, another mental model will be to think about leverage. So maybe the goal of this project can be, I want to do more in less time. So I want things faster. I want to be more, I want to leverage my data. So I might want to be more data driven. I might want to collaborate with more people. Today, my Excel spreadsheet is limited to the demand planner, but maybe I want input from salespeople. So I want to collaborate because that I believe will give me better outcomes. So we can think mentally in terms of the leverage that this project can and this software selection can provide me. And last but not the least, we have to imagine results. We have to think in terms of the business output. So we can say,
okay, if we do this project, maybe we'll get better plans. So what does that mean? That could mean in the demand planning project an increase in forecast accuracy. Similarly, I might say if I have better demand plan or better supply plan, I may see a reduction in inventory or maybe some other supply chain costs. Or maybe I will see an increase in market share because I plan my supply chain so well, companies want to work with me. So these are different ways to evaluate goals. This is obviously not a full list, but you have to come at it from this type of a mindset that allows you to then list down the different values that you would create for yourself. All right, so now we reach the vendor evaluation rubric. I said earlier that you do not want the selection process to be very subjective. You do want to introduce objectivity. And so you want to have a criteria, a matrix where you say, what are the things that are important to me? So for example, on the screen, we have some examples. We are saying time to implement is important, cost is important, security is important, and you can provide different weights on it. You can say time to implement is more important, for example, than security. So whatever that is, and if you have existing vendor, maybe a company 2, a company 3, these are different vendors, then you want to evaluate them according to your evaluation framework, apply the weighted criteria, and then potentially reach a score, which can then give you some objective level of which vendor is leading in the process. So you might want to do this for the types of criteria listed here. You may want to evaluate features, and on a later stage, certainly in an RFP process, we may want to increase the number of things that we want to use. So one thing I would caution here is that no one should choose software just based on vendor hype. Always think in terms of your business challenges, always think in terms of your business value. Don't get caught up in AI this and machine learning that. Don't focus too much on features, but again, come back to how is it going to create value for me? How am I going to move my business forward? So just because someone has a great dashboard does not mean, great value. And you, again, always want to keep coming back to great value for your company. All right. So now if we put all of that kind of in a timeline mindset or a framework here, series of steps. So we have to think timeline, we have budget, we have resources, and we have to manage the risk. So timeline, budget, resources, we already kind of talked about. The risk management part is important. Early on in this process, we have to identify and mitigate the risks. The risks can be cost overruns. This risk can be vendor stability. What if you start the project and the vendor just disappears? It could be vendor resource availability or your own resource availability. Because, for example, if you hit that peak demand period, you may not have any time available with your people, and so on. So you have to have some thought in this process about the different risks that you can get. Okay, so now we have some level of organization behind us, and now we are ready to look at vendors. So how do we create a list of vendors to evaluate? Well, there are multiple ways, of course. If you are totally objective about it, you will go to industry sources and you will pick out, for example, from Gartner Magic Quadrant, maybe some vendors from there. Now, Gartner Magic Quadrant, the way it is published by default, is across all industries, all sizes. But if you click on their website, you can actually filter it to my company type, meaning my industry, my size, my company, the size of my company, and you can get a more fine-tuned Magic Quadrant for yourself. So from there, you can pick 3 or 4 that make sense to you. Similarly, there are other organizations, IBF or Institute for Business Forecasting. You may go to supply chain planning conferences. So from there, you can make a list. And sometimes because of a previous vendor relationship for one of the executives in the company, you may want to include them because they had a good experience with that vendor in a different job. or in a sister business unit sometimes. Sometimes you have an incumbent vendor. So maybe you are not the type of company that is still using Excel, in which case then maybe you want to include that incumbent vendor if the experience with them is absolutely not horrendous. So you can make a list, and what we recommend is that you have about 5 to 7 companies. Don't go for 30 at this early stage, and probably don't go all the way down to 2, because you do want to at least see what all is available in the marketplace. So you might have a vendor list that may look like this, where you say, I have the existing vendor, so obviously there are some pros. I have the existing relationship, the implementation time is basically 0, and I like the team, and maybe there's some familiarity. But then I have vendor 1 who is coming from Gartner and Q. They have this right size fit, and there's lots of marketing buzz, so I want to see what they have to offer. Vendor 2, I like them because they have a streamlined implementation process. Plus, I really like their interface based on how they appear on the website, so I want to evaluate that. Vendor 3, somebody I met at IBF. Vendor 4 is a positive peer recommendation, maybe within my company or maybe outside. I've also heard they are very affordable, so I may want to look at them. Vendor 5 is again from Gartner and Q, but they have some niche expertise in my industry. And vendor 6, kind of relative unknown, but they have very competitive pricing and highly customizable. They are highly customizable, so that has piqued my interest, and I want to look at it. Now, I'm not saying this is the exact criteria you would have. My point is that you should make a list of 5 to 7 companies, and you should be very clear and document why you put them on this list. What was the thing that intrigued you to begin with? So now that we have a list of about 5 to 7, and again, I'm stressing that you don't want 30 because that'll be too much work. You cannot put too many companies in this time in this part of the process. So at this time, you are ready to issue a request for information. Now, this is a relatively light document. It is not a full-blown RFP. You are asking some relatively simple questions. The reason for that is long RFPs this early in the process may not be the best approach. Sometimes, especially early on, vendors will give you a lot of canned responses because they also know that if you've told them that you're looking at 7 companies, they know you're very early. And in that early part, they may give you canned responses, more theoretical. Certainly, if you have a very detailed RFP, vendors will ask you to give them enough time to fill up the RFP, which will delay the process, and so on. So let me just say that long RFPs in the early part is not such a great approach. So start with RFI. And in the RFI, don't go to nth degree of detail. You want to ask, which vendors fit my budget, my timeline? Are they in my geography? Do they have experience in my industry? Are they big enough for me to be comfortable to work with them? And basically use this type of an analysis and maybe a short demo to qualify them to move them to the next round. So the idea is that from a long list, you want to go to the short list where you want to have a much more detailed presentation from them. So at this stage, the criteria for evaluation could be the supply chain maturity and fit. For example, has the vendor worked with similar companies in similar situations? You may want to look at some level of functional capabilities. Do they have the core supply chain functions? For example, right now I'm looking for a demand planning project, but potentially in the future, I may look at supply, I may look at scheduling. Do they check all those boxes? I like AI, ML. Do they have that? All that kind of good stuff. Integration, you may want to see, hey, I'm a SAP shop or Oracle shop or Microsoft shop. Can they integrate with them? Can they pull data and push data into those systems? What kind of support and training do these guys provide? Is this consistent with how I see it should be for my company? Certainly budget and timeline are very important because you don't want to shortlist a company that is, well, way out of your comfort zone in terms of how much you want to spend. So these criteria or similar criteria can be used to go from your original 7 companies to roughly 2 to 3. Now, hidden in here is a short demo. That's how you get to see the functional capabilities. That's how you get to see some amount of how the integration works, what the interface looks like, and so on. All right, so we have now reached polling question number 3. What is your biggest concern regarding system integration with a new supply chain planning tool? Is it that it should be compatible with existing ERP? Is it that you need to data synchronization across multiple sources? So it can be ERP and a data lake and a data mart and all that. Is it scalability and future integrations? Is it implementation costs and time? Or maybe this is not something you concern yourself with too much because you're thinking supply chain planning integration is not really my concern. So I'd love to hear from you on this question. All right, so roughly half of you said data synchronization across multiple sources is very important. We are also seeing this as an area where lots of questions are coming up. People don't only want to integrate with the ERP, they want to integrate with the whole IT landscape within the company. And so the vendor they select should be able to integrate, with multiple sources. So that's very consistent. Thank you for your responses. Okay, so let's move to the next step. So based on all these RFI responses, as I said, we want to go from about 7 to 2 to 3. And so, certainly we have the demo. We like what we see. How does it, how easy it is? Do they have how easy to use it is? What does the look and feel like? Do they have the important functions and features that I'm interested in? How would the day in life of the planner look like? But also we want to evaluate, can we afford this? How's the timeline? How's the, does this fit our budget? Can they deliver our management's ROI ratio? Let me say a word on that. In many companies, management has requirements about our ROI. They will say, we will only invest $1 if the return is at least $3 or $5 or $7, depending on the company. So if at least the stated number from the vendor should be able to qualify or at least deliver what the management is after. Similarly, management may say, I want the payback period to be less than 7 months. Well, does the vendor claim that their payback period is less than 7 months? Now, if these terms are new to you, we have other webinars on the question of how to calculate ROI, so you may want to look at that. Then, based on this criteria, we want to reduce from the original 7 or so to 3. So here, if in the schematic, now we have shortlisted from all the way from 7 vendors, so vendors 1 through 7. We have rejected vendor 1, vendor 3, vendor 4, and vendor 6 based on the criteria. And now we are left with vendor 2, vendor 5, and vendor 7. Notice, this is not the final selection. We still have 3 contenders, but we are moving forward in our process. So now, at long last, we've reached the stage where we want to do a detailed RFP. RFP again stands for request for proposal. So when we are crafting a detailed RFP, there are things to include and there are things not to include. So certainly from my standpoint, you want to start with the company background and you want to start with the challenge you're facing and trying to solve. In this document, you should specify the particular use cases that are of use to you or of importance to you, where you are asking the vendor to demonstrate the actual application using these use cases. Certainly, there's place here for technical requirements and integration needs. Technical requirements can include a list of function features. It can include things like, I want to do scenario planning, simulation, optimization, forecasting methods, technical stuff, as well as integration. You should clearly say, I have these 3 systems that I want to integrate with. Then you want to say any implementation and support expectations. That could mean, hey, I want the project to be done in 6 months, starting in June and going live before December, for example, and I have users around the world, so I have support expectations around the clock. Can you support that? And then, of course, if there are scalability things in mind, for example, hey, I'm a $1 billion company now, but I intend to grow. And the expectation is that we'll be a $3 billion company in 5 years, and we want to select a vendor that will grow with us and will be able to scale and deliver value when we are $3 billion company. So these are things to include. What I have noted as a little bit of a negative is that sometimes these RFPs have anything and everything under the sun when it comes to functions and features. I have seen spreadsheets where you may have 200 functions in demand sheet, and then a separate worksheet for supply planning where there will be another 200, and inventory where there will be another 200. And I say, please don't do that. Try to think hard. You may get a template from someone like a Gartner, and certainly the Gartner template will have those things because they want to cover all the bases. But by the time you issue it to vendors, please trim it down to things that are important to you. Think about why a certain piece is important to you. In fact, since the vendors also are aware of the Gartner list, for example, or industry-specific, industry standard list, they will be able to check all the boxes, but that doesn't mean that they have really differentiated themselves. So ask the question in a way that it applies to your business so that the vendor's response can give you a clear understanding of how they can meet a particular requirement or not meet a particular requirement. So let me just say that RFPs with 5,000 rows of yes, no, or 1 to 5 kind of scoring are a bad idea. Please limit it to how you would be benefiting from that RFP and the responses within your business. All right. So as you look at this, you may have, again, some more detailed key vendor criteria. Remember, when we did the first part, the criteria were simpler. But here, now that we are looking at the final 3 and we are trying to get to the final 1, we may say, hey, what kind of functionality exists, how customizable or configurable it is it how scalable it is, so that when I grow, they can grow as well. So that could be one area. Certainly now we are very interested in ease of use, role-based accessibility. Can they support workflows? Because it's, for example, supply chain planning is a monthly process and you have to have a monthly workflow. So can it support that? Integration, of course, we have talked about it many times now. So can it integrate with my systems? Is it easy? Is it difficult? Does it take a lot of time to do the integration? Are there connectors or APIs available? Then we talked about budget, but now we'll introduce a concept called total cost of ownership. So once you buy these software, you cannot really replace them the next month. Once you buy them, you're probably going to use them for 5 years. So you need to think about it in terms of a total cost of ownership over some extended period, which typically is 3 to 5 years. So you're now asking the question, hey, if I factor in the license price, the implementation, the training, the hosting, all those other costs over an extended period of 5 years, what is the total cost of ownership? Because the way vendors may present their pricing, you may want to compare them based on an apples to apples type of consideration, and total cost of ownership provides you with a way to do that. And then you need to evaluate support and training. Will they be there for you once you go live? Who will do the support? Will it be the vendor themselves? Will it be an implementation partner? Where are they located? Can they do it 24/7 if your users are around the world? So all of that. Can they do it in a particular language if that is important to you, for example? All right. So in this part of the process, even though we have moved on from the early part where we were doing RFI, we have to have a very similar rubric or a framework to do the final evaluation. The things here may be different from what they were in the RFI stage, or they may be very similar or maybe even the same. But now you are doing a much more rigorous analysis of how this particular software is meeting your needs. So you may have to mix both subjective as well as objective criteria here. Objective could include things like feature checklists, pricing models, security compliance. Subjective could be vendor reputation, ease of partnership, look and feel, listening skills, likability of the vendor, the presenters from the vendor, to be more precise. So all of that should be included. Now, one question I get asked is, if we have such a matrix, do I publish it back to the vendors? Do I let them know that this is how I'm going to evaluate? My feeling about that is that you need to share that there is a pre-established framework, yes, and here are the general categories. but giving too much detail that we would weigh this one this way, this particular metric this way, and this other one is not so important, can allow a vendor, and especially if you share the whole spreadsheet with the full weights, can really make the vendor skew their presentation in a way that just applies to that or fits very well with that weighted criteria. So I would say help them share the criteria, but at a reasonably high level, and keep some details with you so that you can actually not force them into doing the demo a particular way, because that can be very misleading then. Remember, these vendors do demos for a living. They are in the business to make and sell software. So if you give them exact criteria, next thing you know, your demo is exactly along those lines. And sometimes it can lead to a bad outcome. For example, if we say it in a funny way, you can have a successful surgery, but the patient still dies. By that I mean, you select the vendor that scores the most because they tailored their demo and presentations to your weighting matrix, but it was not necessarily a real alignment with how you are going to create value. So just be careful about that. Okay. At this time in the process, because we are looking at a very detailed evaluation now, we want to do use cases. So shortlist your vendors. Again, we are at 2 or 3 vendors, and you are evaluating them based on your data, specific use cases, and you're looking for how well you understand your process. They understand your processes, how good were their listening skills, how good was their understanding, the willingness to incorporate and change your incorporate and change the demo based on your input. And you can see live how the system performs, what the user experience would be like as they click around. So once you have done those cases, you also want to look at other types of fit, like you want to now look at culture fit. Can we work well with this vendor in the long term? You want to evaluate their listening skills. For example, do they hear your concerns and adapt their approach to your specific needs? And to get some outside data point, you may want to do customer references. So you may want to reach out to ask them, how can you talk to some of their customers? Let's talk about that a little bit. So vendor references. You want to do industry-specific references as much as possible. By that I mean that if the references are within your industry or have some similarities, they may be the most valuable. You may ask things like, hey, how easy was it? Were they able to bring out templates, best practices, strategies that just worked out of the box, given that we are in this industry? How good were they in terms of proactively anticipating challenges? And so, your own industry specific reference, they can speak your language, they probably know your KPIs, they probably know how your workflows are organized, and you really can get some very good input from these types of references. Now, when it comes to references, my suggestion would be that you look for one long-term reference. This is a company that has worked with this particular vendor over the long term, so you can get some relationship insight, business insight, certainly the user insight on the software, but you can get a sense of how good or bad the value creation was. And then one near-term reference. This would be a company that has done the selection relatively recently, and so you're looking at, hey, how did the project go? How was the execution ability of this company? All right, so now if we try to summarize the vendor considerations, and kind of say, you certainly want to evaluate the objective things, but you also want to look at vendor culture, their collaboration. You want to prioritize long-term fit versus short-term fit. You want to see if they have implementation partners. You want to make sure you have communication open both with the vendor as well as with implementation partners. By that, I mean that sometimes the software vendor just sells the software. The implementation is done by some other company, so you want to have that. You want to recognize training and onboarding process that they will provide to you, because that needs to have a match with how you would use the system. Certainly ROIs, success metrics, and one final not or do not do this version would be not to make decisions just based on flashy interface or use of flashy keywords that are existing in the marketplace. Today, that would be, for example, AI. So if you have a vendor that is AI this and AI that, evaluate them on the other criteria just as well, because AI by itself, while good and important, is not going to solve everything. All right, so now we are ready to make potentially our final decision. So the way that goes is sometimes you would have this rubric and this process, and at the end, you may be getting one clear winner. One vendor really separates from everybody else. If that's the case, fantastic. You kind of know your kickoff date, or maybe you have to select it with the vendor. And then you begin the process of getting into working relationship with them. So you begin to scope out, have a scoping session, design workshop. Maybe you write the SOW, which is statement of work. And then you have to review, negotiate, execute your contract. This is where your procurement team will get involved. Begin the work on data preparation. Think about where the hardware will be located. Is it going to be in the cloud? Is it going to be on premise? All of that. So if there's a clear winner, you have to go into this methodology, this step. But sometimes what will happen is you will have two vendors that are so close, they are neck and neck, and you really cannot decide which to use. In that case, you still have work to do. You may have to give them additional use cases. You may have to ask for more ROI comparisons. You may have to do more industry references. So whatever you have to do, if there's no clear winner, ultimately the goal is to get to the clear winner so you can get into the next steps. All right. So let's say now, congratulations, you have your winner, you've selected them. Well, now you need to give the considerations of procurement team. So procurement team might have their own requirements. They may say, look, once you know who you want to work with, give them to me and I will work with them to determine the final price, the payment terms. I'll make sure that the statement of work is appropriately written at the level of detail that our management likes. I'll make sure to document the total cost of ownership. I'll make sure to get agreement on service level agreements because, I need to know if they will respond within half an hour or if they will respond within 2 days. I might want to decide what exit strategy and termination clauses might be there. So these things, especially with procurement and legal teams, because there's some legal people who will be involved here to try to write the different parts of the contract, can easily take, if you're lucky, 1 month, and if you're unlucky, 6 months. So knowing your company and how long procurement and legal take within your company is important so that you can put that in the timeline as you go through this part of the process. All right, so now you've made the selection, you've done the negotiation, you're ready to start the project. At this time, there's an important question. Hey, do I let the other vendors know, or when do I let the other vendors know? I would say it's very important to give other vendors feedback. It's just professional to do. They will really appreciate because it allows them to improve their own processes. So as you're implementing or rather creating the implementation timeline and the roadmap with the new vendor, it's the right time to go back, give the other vendors feedback, what you liked, what you did not like, and what was the reason ultimately to select the vendor. Sometimes you may want to let them know which vendor was selected. Sometimes you may decide not to do that. Both are fine. That's not necessarily a requirement that you share which vendor was selected. But certainly at a high level, you want to tell them what are the things they can improve and what are the things that really look well with their software. All right, so that would then mean that you've concluded the selection process and you're ready to hand it over to the implementation team. And so at some point in the future, we plan to talk about how to implement, but that is a topic for a different webinar on a different day. So let's conclude this here. I'll turn this over to Kristen.
Great, thanks. That was a lot of very helpful information that you shared during the session. We do have a few minutes left to do a Q&A, so if anyone has any questions that they'd like to submit, they can do that, and we do have some that have already come in, so I'll get started with those. But the first one we have is, how long is a good selection process?
I mean, I think if you have a lot of people involved, a selection process can unfortunately run very long. I would say that this is a significant spend for any company, and so having too flippant a process, too quick a process is probably not right. At the same time, if you are going through this for a year, you're going too long. I would say a 6-month process is probably quite common. And in those 6 months, maybe the last 45 days are reserved for the procurement and the legal guys. And the first 4.5 months are for the evaluation by the team. So that would be my answer. Now, have I seen processes that are longer? Yes, I have seen 6 years long sales cycle. And I have seen sales cycles that have been 1 or 2 months. But I think 6 months is probably a good middle ground that I would recommend.
Okay, great. Another question is, how big should the selection team be?
Also a good question. I think I have seen selection teams where we had at least one. I remember we had to do 14 different demos. Each demo had at least 10 participants. Some were common, and in every demo, some were new. So in the end, we had probably done a demo to 70 or so people. That's just too much. I would say if your selection team is about 10 people, that's very appropriate. You want to have people representing the views of different organizations. You don't want to have the whole organization. So what do I mean? For example, if you want to have the sales team provide input, don't invite the whole sales team to be in the selection process. Ask them to recommend one person who will represent their views, and they can conduct their own interviews internally and determine what their needs are for the whole department. But then this one person should be representing that entire department. So roughly 10 people, somewhere in that vicinity is good. Too few, and probably you don't have enough representation, and many more, and probably you are looking at stretching your selection process, which goes back to the first question.
Okay, great. Let's see. How do you balance time investment and running longer demos with the urgency to select a vendor?
Well, I mean, longer demos themselves, even if they are long, you are looking at half a day, maybe a day-long demo, and if you have 3 vendors in the RFP process, that is 3 days worth. I don't think that in itself creates an issue. What creates an issue is if you then repeat that with this group and that group and that group, like I was giving the example where we did 14 demos. Now that sales cycle, just the demo portion of it ran for multiple months, I think 8 months in total. So that you should avoid. But the demo itself is typically relatively short, at the most, like I said, a day. So if you have 3 vendors and you are doing 3 full days of demo, that by itself does not add to the timeline, as long as you can organize the calendars and get them to present and so on. Because multiple teams are involved, it may take you a full month to get those 3 days scheduled, but that in itself does not create the lengthy schedule. The lengthy schedule comes in because you do the demo, then you want more clarification demos, then you do maybe you allow someone else to have more clarification. By the time you're said and done, you might be doing 4 follow-on demos for clarifications. Those are the types of things you need to really limit and say, hey, as we do these demos, and at this time, maybe with 3 vendors, we may have done 12 different demos. Are we really able to remember which screen was shown by which vendor? It's easy for the vendor to do the demo, but the people who are seeing these software screens for the first time, over time, they can get very confusing, and they may remember the wrong things with the wrong vendors. I've certainly had sales cycles where I was asked a question about something I never presented, and I could only figure that out, that they were asking me a question based on something they saw on someone else's screen. So these are key things to think, and therefore stretching the demo part is not very good. I would say do the demos. If there are 3 demos, let's say even if they are day long, try to squeeze them all within a week. Get everybody traveling to one location, get the demos done, and then basically use that to make your decision.
Okay, great. I think that that is very helpful as well. So that is all the time we have today. If you did submit a question and we didn't get to it, we will still respond to you via email, so don't worry there. We will have, as Sujit mentioned, the next webinar, how to implement the supply chain planning software after you've selected it. So be sure to join us for that. Registration will be open soon, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.